But the underreported story about women in early Adventist church leadership is that they served in many leadership roles: administrators, pastors, evangelists, editors, educators.
And so what we need to do is fill in those gaps by telling the stories of the contributions of women. And sometimes that's a little bit harder to do. It takes more work. You have to piece them together because they weren't as in the spotlight, like Ellen White was in the spotlight. But you do, if you look carefully, you can find those stories.
Hi, I'm Heidi, a historian and host of They Also Served, where we discover the lives of little-known women who made a big impact on Christianity in America and around the world. Emily Clemens Pearson, Clorinda S. Minor, Abigail Folsom, Sojourner Truth, and other women had eagerly hoped for Christ to come on October 22, 1844. But while they waited on Christ, they were not idle. They eagerly spread the good news of Christ's soon return through print and by mouth. Last episode, we tackled how these women played such an important role in the formation of the Millerite Movement. What happened after Christ didn't come on October 22, 1844? Did women return home to be the angels of the household? What role did they play in the formation of the churches that came out of the Millerite Movement? Ellen White and her family had become Millerites. Christ's soon coming was an incident that she looked forward to eagerly. She had been sickly as a child, due to an injury when she was about 9 years old. It took a long time for her to recover from the traumatic injury. The injury forced her to end her formal education early. She had hoped for the return of her best friend Jesus and an end to her suffering and pain. When Christ didn't come in 1844, along with other Millerites, Ellen, who was a teenager at the time, was deeply disappointed. But October 1844 was just the beginning of her engagement in religion.
Ellen White is considered to be one of the 3 founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, along with her husband James White and Joseph Bates.
A group of former Millerites after 1844 coalesced around a shared belief in the soon coming of Christ and the Seventh-day Sabbath. In 1863, they formally organized as the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Ellen White never considered herself the head of this new group, but her writing, her preaching, her visions were definitely instrumental in its founding.
Cindy Tutsch has worn many hats in her career: a teacher, a pastor, and an administrator. Before retiring, she worked at the White Estate, an organization dedicated to telling the stories of the early founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Ellen White's role was probably more focused on casting a vision for the fledgling community and providing spiritual guidance through the entire 70 years of her public ministry. And even today, her written voice continues to be heard and appreciated.
Ellen White wasn't the only woman involved in the foundation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. As highlighted in our last episode, Millerite women had been actively involved as writers, editors, and preachers.
So it's not surprising that in the wake of the Millerite movement, women will still provide a significant leadership role within Adventism.
Michael W. Campbell is the Director of Archive Statistics and Research at the North American Division of Seventh-day Adventist. He has authored several books on Adventist history and Ellen White, and served as the lead editor of the recently published Oxford Handbook of Seventh-day Adventism.
Because Ellen White played such a significant leadership role, a lot of that attention has been focused on her. But there were other women who were in those circles of influence and exerted leadership. We don't know their stories as well, but that doesn't make them any less important to the rise of Adventism.
As Michael notes, political and institutional history has focused on people in the top leadership positions. But to understand a country's history, or the history of Christianity, it's important to broaden our scope, to look at all layers in society.
And so part of what the job of the historian is to go back and try to find those pieces of the puzzle and begin to put them together so people can see just how significant the contributions of women were in that formative stage during the 19th century of our Adventist roots. One of the ways I was able to kind of piece this together was to go back through the letters in the review. So going back to the 1860s through the 1870s, every issue has a number of letters.
The articles and poems in the early periodicals were like an early form of social media. Letters to the editor were a way to post an update or express a deeply held opinion that could be read by friends or complete strangers.
People are reading those articles. They're also writing responses. They're promulgating them in church, teaching them in Sabbath school, singing songs, and everything else. And so where you really begin to see women who make up and provide that leadership and stability and support within that Adventist social network in this 19th century formative period is you see this in the letters. And so these are the responses. My faith was encouraged, and we had a monthly or a quarterly meeting here in our area, and we had the Lord's Supper, and it was such a beautiful experience, right?
Women were involved not only in writing letters, but described vivid accounts of early Adventist worship. Women's letters reveal how actively women were engaged in creating the routines and rhythms of weekly worship at their local church.
I started actually literally taking those letters and quantifying them so you could actually begin to see women did in fact make up the majority, roughly about 60%. You still have men writing in, of course. You definitely see there's a clear majority of women who are engaged with the ideas and helping to disseminate. They'll write their testimony back. I was convicted about this belief, or I was led by the Lord to adopt health reform or some other aspect of Adventism.
And what did their involvement look like?
One of my personal favorites is Mary Frances Maxon. She will be a Seventh-day Baptist who converts to early Sabbatarian Adventism in 1862 in Adams Center, Western New York. And she will become where she's writing in almost, not quite every issue, but pretty regularly, and she actually writes theological articles, beautiful pieces, reflections on the Lord's Supper. Some of my favorite descriptions of early Adventist worship come from her pen.
In 1863, Mary wrote of her belief of her role in Christianity to the main denominational paper, Second Advent Review and Sabbath Herald.
How anxious I am for God's cause to triumph, and triumph it must and will. My whole heart and interests are bound up in it, and I feel that we, the individual members of the little flock, should stretch every nerve, make any and every sacrifice for its advancement.
And what's interesting is I tried for a long time to figure out who she was, what happened to her, because she got married about 1867, and then a short time later, wouldn't you know it, she dies. So when I initially had done work on her trying to figure out who she was, I couldn't find an obituary because, well, her name had changed. And of course, I couldn't quite figure it out because I couldn't find the obituary that tragically, again, she died from tuberculosis, wouldn't you know it. And so she's, again, one of these bright, shining stars, someone who loves to write, a poet, as well as writing very beautiful, introspective pieces about her faith, and as well as a number of theological articles. So a very significant woman whose story has been largely hidden just because we couldn't figure out who she was.
Annie Rebekah Smith was an editor of the Second Advent Review and Sabbath Herald that Mary Maxon had written to.
Now, she will somewhat be overshadowed by her younger brother, Uriah Smith, because he will just frankly live a whole lot longer and be the editor of the review. But before her younger brother came on board, she was already in Rochester helping James and Ellen White. And she was the one who, at that very early formative stage, when James and Ellen White had to go out traveling, she was effectively the managing editor. She kept everything running, was editing the review, was writing articles. She was a poet extraordinaire. We have a number of our hymns, even to this day in our hymnal, that come from her pen. Now, a lot of people, may not necessarily realize, because she didn't live that long. She tragically would die at the age of 27 from tuberculosis, which, if you go through the old obituaries, it's like the leading cause of death for Adventists or the public in general, really, in the 19th century. She doesn't have a long tenure, but the time that she does have when she's given her heart to the Lord, and working during that formative stage is crucial. She writes a lot, that she's a poet. One of the unsung areas in studying women in Adventism, in Adventist history, is the contributions of women as literary figures and as poets. And certainly she looms large on the horizon.
In the long poem, Annie wrote of her faith in Christ, her friend within those courts above, and hope in Christ's soon coming in heaven. She wrote,
"And when the strife is o'er, the victory won, and we no more in weariness shall roam, oh then how sweet life's care and labor done, to have at last the Christian's welcome home."
Incredibly talented young woman who really was the glue helping to hold that Sabbatarian Adventist movement together. And that's really what we're trying to look at is, who were those other people after that top leadership circle, the who were really keeping Adventism together. And when you start breaking that down bit by bit, you see that women are the ones who are really kind of helping to organize and sustain and to promulgate the Adventist message.
Women held other roles, though, than just as writers. Adelia Patton Van Horn was another significant figure.
She will serve actually as treasurer of the General Conference, which is quite significant, one of the three officers of the denomination.
The General Conference was the highest administrative body of the fledgling church.
She would be the editor of the Youth Instructor, so our key early formative publication for Adventist young people. And she will work collaboratively with her husband doing evangelistic work as they will travel around. But she in her own right was very significant for her leadership abilities and as well as her acumen.
If we count all those doing Bible work and leading out in publishing and healthcare and education and other branches of the cause, the Adventist movement, many of these women in other leadership roles received the missionary license or the missionary credential, but they would not be included among those 28 that had ministerial license. Those other female workers were definitely leaders in their sphere. And I think we can say that the early Seventh-day Adventist denomination was remarkably forward-thinking in its time regarding women in church leadership. The ministry of Ellen White was contested in part because she was female. So the church had to decide very early what it believed about women in spiritual leadership and ministry.
The early church periodical held articles urging women to use their spiritual gifts to share the gospel message. B.F. Robbins wrote an article to what he called the female disciples and the third angel's message, decrying women who were prone to inactivity and silence, when by divine grace she may be so abundantly qualified to edify and encourage. He further urged women to follow the example of Mary Magdalene, the first person to proclaim the good news of Christ's resurrection.
My sisters, do you say, I am weak and disqualified? I am doubting and fearful? Be as consecrated and faithful as the loving Blessed Marys. Let the consecration to God of your all be entire.
I love Uriah Smith's comment, what he said about Joel 2:28 and 29. He said, referring to that passage in Joel, must embrace public speaking of some kind for women. This, we think, is but half of its meaning. I mean, that's so profound. It's so deep.
Women inspired by their belief in Christ's soon return felt compelled to speak out.
Again, women will never become the majority of preachers, but neither were they the majority in the Millerites, but they were a significant minority where they were enabled and empowered to be able to publicly proclaim the Adventist message. One of the ones that I particularly admire is the story of Minnie Sipe. She will actually go with her husband and they will travel around, pop around several different places where they eventually end up in Oklahoma. While she's in Oklahoma, she begins to start sharing her faith. She's invited to publicly share her faith. And so she's challenged about her beliefs. And so she does that. And one of the things that they challenge her with, is it permissible as a woman to be able to proclaim the message? And there was actually a young lady after they had one of these debates with one of the other preachers in town, and she actually comes up to her and calls her a woman preacher. And this kind of shocks her, right? And so this is her autobiography. She writes about this. This was a great trial, for I had never admired a woman preacher.
Although she did speak publicly on her faith, up to that point, she had never seen herself as a preacher.
And as she's praying over the situation, I'm looking at her autobiography where she talks about this. She's afraid of opposition, of public criticism. Will she be accepted in this part of the country as a preacher? And she said that a strong impression came over me. My grace is sufficient for you. And then she got up from her knees and left it in God's hand. She was given more opportunities to go out and continue sharing her faith. One of the local ministers will challenge her that how could you possibly publicly, women should keep silent, right? And so she will actually go to another one of these debates. They're challenging her belief on the Sabbath and Christ's soon return. And at the end of it, the Methodist minister, she says, actually challenges her on this point of whether she can be a woman preacher. And this is how she responds to him. And I'm quoting here from her autobiography. I got my commission from Jesus himself. He commissioned Mary after his resurrection to go and tell the brethren that he had risen. And then I continued, I am following in Mary's footsteps, telling the people that he is coming again. Paul in the 16th chapter of Romans recommends a number of women workers, especially Phoebe, whom he asked the church to assist. I also told them that Priscilla and Aquila were Paul's co-laborers in the gospel, and that at one time Paul sent a brother to them that they might more fully teach him the way to eternal life. And then the Bible mentions the following women, leaders: Miriam, who assisted Moses; Deborah, who led the forces of Israel; Anna, the prophetess in the house of God; Philip had 4 daughters who prophesied. Others might be mentioned. It is true that women are told in a certain chapter to keep silence in case of confusion, but in the same chapter, men are told to keep silence on certain occasions. And I quoted Acts 2, 17 and 18, told my brother in the ministry that he was behind the times, that all civilization was coming to realize that woman is to be man's helpmeet in every good work. God created woman to stand by the side of man. He did not take a part of man's feet to create woman to show that he should rule over her. Neither did he take a part of man's brain to show that woman should rule over the man, but he took a rib from his side, showing that she should stand by his side, that they should work together to advance the cause of right in the world. And so you could just imagine that pathos-filled response, that rebuttal, saying, yeah, it makes sense. If women were proclaiming Christ's resurrection, then women should be a part in proclaiming his soon return a second time.
Minnie also conducted ministry by giving away devotional materials, writing letters about her faith to friends and acquaintances, and giving her family and friends Bible studies. She ministered in practical ways too, through sharing food and caring for the sick. Her efforts bore fruit. She, along with her husband, started a church in Oklahoma in 1902. The church was grateful for her efforts and sent her a check for $25 and offered her a job as an evangelist. For context, in 1897, a person could buy a ready-made men's wool suit for $4.85, or a pair of women's leather boots for under $2 in the Sears Roebuck catalog. Her husband urged her to take the job. She would spend close to 30 years as an evangelist, pastor, and as a church administrator, and continued her ministry during her retirement. During those years, she experienced the tragic loss of a son and 2 husbands, and worked in Iowa, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Washington, Oregon, Florida, and even the Bahamas. Sarah Lindsey was another woman who found her calling to serve God surprising.
Sarah Lindsey is raised in a Christian home in Pennsylvania and in western Pennsylvania through upper New York. And she will convert to Adventism, and she will meet a young clockmaker, watchmaker, who has some children and becomes Seventh-day Adventist, and they will get married. He will play a supportive role to her because she's invited to help because of her work in her church. She takes a leadership role, and she's increasingly invited to do evangelism because she's a very successful evangelist. At one point, one of my favorite stories about her is that the circus will come to town. They're saying, who can compete against the circus, And they say, well, Sarah Lindsey. So she is obviously thought of as one of the more interesting and powerful preachers in that particular community.
And then disaster struck in New York, Pennsylvania conference. A conference was what Adventist leaders called the local regional administrative unit. The president, Nathan Fuller, was accused of embezzling church funds, attempting to seduce multiple women, and adultery.
Who's the person that really comes in to help heal and unite all of these very hurt congregations after this kind of crisis? Well, once again, it's Sarah Lindsey. She's recognized as being the first Adventist woman to receive a minister's license. She'll continue holding a ministerial license through the 1870s and really is a stalwart pillar of Adventism there in Western Pennsylvania and New York. No one's ever written a proper biography of her, but as you start digging into the archives, little bits and pieces begin popping up, and you start putting that story together. You realize what an influential person she was for the church and how much stability and just building up the church through her evangelism and outreach efforts. By the way, just this last year, I found in the archives of the Seventh-day Baptist General Conference, at the end of her life, she wrote an autobiographical sketch in her own handwriting in which she shares a little bit about her conversion to the Seventh-day Adventist message and her calling as a preacher. So we find, we're still finding these little vignettes. I've had people say, well, if women were so influential in Adventism and Adventist history, then how come I haven't heard them before? I repeatedly will say this, that just because you don't know their story doesn't mean they didn't exist.
Oh, there were so many women leaders in the Adventist church in the early years. I'm going to just mention a few. There was Martha Byington Amadon. She was an early educator, I think the first Seventh-day Adventist church school teacher. And then Maude Sisely, she was a Bible instructor, a colporteur, and educator. She was the first single woman missionary to Europe. She served as an evangelist alongside of John Loughborough, who was also very instrumental in early Adventist evangelism. She was a missionary in Africa and Australia. And I have to mention Araki. We don't hear too much about her, but she was a Japanese Bible worker who was blind and who actually serves as the pastor of her church throughout World War II. And Louise Cloiser, she was editor and a ministerial department administrator. Even in Bible times, as well as the early history of the Adventist church, women have served in almost all capacities, filling a wide variety of roles according to their spiritual gifts.
Celeste Ryan Blyden, who we'll be talking to in a later episode, sums up well what it was like for 19th century women when they heard the call of God to serve.
1840s America, God calls this young girl to share a message that will change the world. And he did it at a time when women couldn't vote everywhere, women couldn't own property, women couldn't have their own bank accounts. It was right at the time of the suffrage movement, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, the time where the first transatlantic, connections are being made. So communication is being able to spread beyond just our little area. And I just don't think it is any accident that God did this at this time. I feel like it sent a message that, number one, he could call anybody. He can use anybody, man and women. And that he can go against the grain of culture and society to accomplish his work and accomplish his mission.
The many women who served in those early years of formation are too numerous to mention in this short episode, as Cindy highlights. each of them ignored the gender barriers of 19th century America that urged women to remain quietly at home because they so passionately wanted to share the good news that Christ was coming soon. Through their writing, preaching, and peacemaking, they proclaimed their faith and became gospel bearers. The impact of Annie Smith, Minnie, Sipe, and Kate Lindsey's life on those around them was incalculably diffusive. Join me in 2 weeks as we explore the life of a single woman who became a pioneer missionary to India.
They Also Served is researched, written, and hosted by Heidi Olson Campbell. Thank you to our guests on today's episode, Cindy Tutsch, Michael Campbell, and Celeste Ryan Blyden. This episode was produced by Heidi Olson Campbell and Heather Moore. They Also Served is edited by Nina Volato. Cover art and social media is by Chelsea Ernina. Stephen Husett is our equipment extraordinaire, and this episode was executive produced by Adam Fenner. Thank you to the Adventist Learning Community for making They Also Served possible.